Shalom to the elect of Israel, to the hopeful elect of Israel, you Hebrew Israelites, you so-called Negroes, Latinos, Native Americans, West Indian, and Haitians. Gotta give all praises, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shai, Bahashem, Rekah, Kodash. Double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone who rule well, who teach well, and a sincere salutation to all the Akim, pushing this truth and believing this truth throughout the four winds of the earth, the entire world waking up the hopeful elect. And shalom to the Akwafu who are listening and learning, the few sisters who are listening and learning. I'm Isaiah from the GMS Orlando camp, coming at you with another lesson in truth, facts, faith, and edification, another daily edification. Lord's willing, is be edifying. And this is titled, You Are Hated Because You Are the Salt of the Earth. Lord's willing, is be edifying. And this is for educational purposes only. This is for educational purposes only.
Something terrible happened here. And for decades, people didn't talk about it.
I was an adult before I ever heard about it. It was something that was hidden.
This entire historic community was obliterated.
Bodies dumped in rivers, bodies dumped in mass graves. It was an absolute massacre.
This story isn't one you'll find in most history books. And almost 100 years later, the facts of what exactly happened that day are still unraveling. So we're driving in what's known as Black Wall Street. It's where one of the nation's worst episodes of racial violence took place. In 1921, a neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma called the Greenwood District was a bustling community of Black-owned businesses. Tulsa locals know that period of Greenwood's history as a kind of golden age.
If you can imagine just like an old-time downtown, things like movie theaters, pharmacies, hair salons, and so forth.
They called it Black Wall Street.
It was a mecca. It was a huge success.
But Black Wall Street was also an anomaly. It thrived at a time when the KKK was incredibly active in Oklahoma, and the nation had just been through the Red Summer of 1919, when white mobs murdered Black people in dozens of incidents across the U.S.
There needed to be a sort of match or an igniter tossed on these embers. And that trigger event, was an incident that involved two teenagers. Dick Rowland, 19-year-old Black boy, he's shining shoes downtown. Sarah Page, 17-year-old white girl, who ran an elevator in a downtown building called the Drexel Building. He went to the building, boarded the elevator. Something happened, and Sarah Page began to scream. They both ran out of the elevator.
Now, we don't know exactly what happened in this elevator, but a day later, Rowland was arrested and taken to the courthouse. The local newspaper ran an article claiming Rowland had assaulted Page. Even though Page refused to press charges, the article was essentially a call to action for whites.
A large white mob began to gather on the lawn of the courthouse. Dick Rowland was in jail on the top floor. A number of Black men, several dozen, marched down to the courthouse to protect him, some of them armed. There was a struggle between one of the Black men in the small group and one of the white men in the larger group, and things sort of went south from that point.
Hundreds of white people descended upon Black Wall Street, armed. Black residents withdrew behind the railroad tracks that marked off the Greenwood District. Some of them were armed and fought back, but they were outnumbered by the white mob, which shot their way through. The white mob murdered, they looted, and they set fire to Black Wall Street.
Now, what you need to know is there is nothing new under the sun. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 9. It reads, The thing that have been is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. Is there anything whereof it may be said, See, this is new. It have been already of old time, which was before us. There is no remembrance of former things, neither shall there be any remembrance of things that are to come with those that shall come after. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 15. It reads, That which have been is now, and that which is to be have already been, and power required that which is past. So the same thing that happened in 70 AD, starting in 65 AD, there's nothing new under the sun, man. When the Romans took down Jerusalem, there's nothing new under the sun. And this is Ecclesiastes 4 and 16. There is no end of all the people, even of all that have been before them. They also that come after shall not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity and vexation of spirit. There is no end of all the people, even of all that have been before them. They also that come after them should not rejoice in him. Why? Because they got to suffer the punishment for the iniquity of their fathers. Surely this also is vanity and vexation of spirit.
This was the strategy, if you will, of how to deal with these communities, with these successful Black communities. The effects were disastrous.
For 2 days, the Greenwood district burned. Martial law was declared, and the National Guard was brought in. By the time the massacre ended, Greenwood was in ruins. More than 1,200 homes were destroyed, and 35 blocks burned. The exact number of casualties is harder to pin down. Some initially only reported that white people died. Others reported somewhere between 30 and 100 mostly Black casualties. But estimates now put that number closer to 300. As for those that survived, thousands of them lived in tent cities in the months that followed, and were left to pick up the pieces of rubble they once called home. After the massacre, the cover-up started. Records went missing from city files, including the very article that started it all. It makes photos from this time all the more important as part of the historical record, but back in 1921, these images served a very different purpose. So photo postcards like these were pretty widely distributed after the massacre. At the time, they were a part of white supremacist culture and kept as souvenirs of racially charged crimes. Now they're preserved to make sure this part of Tulsa's history isn't forgotten, and they paint a clear picture of how much destruction there was that day. On the postcards, it's called the Tulsa Race Riot, a name that itself sort of erases what really happened.
By calling it a riot, it's a way of trying to rewrite the history, assuming that there were both sides involved, and that was not the case. I call it a massacre, and I call it that because that's what it was.
Greenwood eventually rebuilt, but nearly a century later, there's a part of this story that still haunts the city. No one actually knows where the victims' bodies are.
We got to find our people. We got to put them at rest. If not, we'll continue to be haunted by what was done so many years ago.
Kavin Ross, a local writer, is one of many in Tulsa descended from people who lost everything in the massacre. So in this cemetery, there are only 2 official victims of the Tulsa Race Massacre. How many victims do you think there are?
After all these years, I think 300 is putting it mild.
In 1997, the city finally put together a commission to study the massacre and help piece together what happened in 1921. They compiled records and eyewitness accounts.
The bullets were just raining down over us.
They set our house on fire. They went right straight to the curtains and set the curtains on fire.
These accounts are especially important now because none of these survivors are alive anymore. And they also provided new information. Some mentioned trucks, like this one, loaded with victims of the riot. One right witness in particular came forth testifying that he saw bodies being dumped in Oaklawn Cemetery.
This is it. This is the area.
Using the survivor accounts, records, and eventually radar, the city was able to pinpoint 3 locations with anomalies in the soil. Only one step was left: to excavate. But it was something the city at the time wasn't up for doing. For many Tulsans, it was a part of history best forgotten and not worth investigating. In some ways, today, that sentiment remains.
Kind of waste of money.
Why do you think that?
It's over, it's done.
But there are clear signs of a city that's ready to come to terms with a dark chapter in its history.
Honestly, that's a lot of missing people that probably had families.
We owe it to the people whose blood has actually fertilized the grounds of this place.
There was a tremendous amount of racism.
Injustice plus time does not equal justice.
Today, a new mayor is reopening the investigation.
I think a pretty basic compact that a city makes with its citizens is, if somebody murders you, we will do everything we can to find out what happened to you and give your family closure. And whether you were murdered yesterday or you were murdered 98 years ago.
The city will be looking into the 3 areas that the commission noted. That process of finding out what lies beneath Tulsa and DNA matching any remains with descendants could take years.
Isaiah 26 and verse 10. Let favor be showed to the wicked, yet will he not learn righteousness. In the land of uprightness will he deal unjustly, and will not behold the majesty of the Lord Yahweh. They can't get right, man. The Lord said what he made crooked cannot be straight. And there's nothing new under the sun.
It was called the Red Summer of 1919, named for the blood that ran through America's cities during months of racial unrest. African-American soldiers had returned home from the Great War, World War I, to a country still teeming with discrimination. And in their quest for civil rights, tensions between blacks and whites reached a tipping point. Deadly race riots broke out in over 24 cities, but one rural town, Elaine, Arkansas, would become the epicenter for the bloodshed. The violence there, lynch mobs, torture, indiscriminate murder, was so horrific it would go down in history not as a race riot, but as the Elaine Massacre. This is history. Dark history. During World War I, more than 350,000 African-American soldiers enlisted to serve. But while they fought for democracy abroad, their own country, America, was still not willing to see them as equal.
White supremacy was very mainstream at this time in the United States. Basically, a lot of African Americans were seeking to obtain their full rights and equality in the United States, and violence was often used by mobs of whites.
Tensions reached a boiling point in the summer of 1919. Race riots broke out in dozens of cities across the country. But in the rural South, something even more menacing was taking form. There, slavery existed in all but name. In a system called sharecropping, farmers provided landowners with labor for a share of crops produced, but the system was rigged.
Ezekiel 35 and verse 2. Son of man, set thy face against Mount Seir, and prophesy against it, and say unto it, Thus saith the Lord Yahweh power. Behold, O Mount Seir, I am against thee, and I will stretch out my hand against thee, and I will make thee most desolate. And I will lay thy cities waste, and thou shalt be desolate. And thou shalt know that I am the Lord Yahweh, because thou hast had a perpetual hatred, and hast shed the blood of the children of Israel by the force of the sword in the time of their calamity, in the time that their iniquity had an end. Therefore, as I live, saith the Lord Yahweh, power, I will prepare thee unto blood, and blood shall pursue thee. Since thou hast not hated blood, even blood shall pursue thee. Thus will I make Mount Seir most desolate, and cut off from it him that passeth out, and him that returneth. And I will fill his mountains with his slain men in thy hills and in thy valleys, and in all thy rivers shall they fall that are slain with the sword. I will make thee perpetual desolation, and thy cities shall not return, and ye shall know that I am the Lord Yahweh. Because thou hast said, these two nations, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, and these two countries shall be mine, and we will possess it, whereas the Lord was there.
Sharecroppers were often kept in perpetual debt.
One black sharecropper raised $500 worth of cotton, and his landlord told him, yeah, but you used $697 worth of supplies, so you owe me money.
Everyone who has any power at this point is working to make sure they keep African American laborers tied to the land.
For roughly 50 years, the system went unchecked. In the fall of 1918, a black man from Arkansas had had enough. Robert Hill had decided to form a union to represent sharecroppers. It was a dangerous decision, and one that would set off a chain of events involving mass murder, torture, and a landmark Supreme Court ruling. But first, he would need to organize.
In his message, Hill was pretty simple and direct. Why is it that we cannot have fair payment for the honest and hard work we do?
Despite the inherent risk involved with challenging whites, World War I veterans and other black sharecroppers became card-carrying members of the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America.
Zechariah chapter 11 and verse 4. Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, my power, feed the flock of the slaughter, whose possessors slay them, and hold themselves not guilty. And they that sell them, say, blessed be the Lord Yahweh, for I am rich. Or blessed be the Lord, for I am rich, and their own shepherds pity them not. This is James chapter 5 and verse 4. It reads, behold, the hire of the laborers which have reaped down your fields, which is of you kept back by fraud, crieth, and the cries of them which have reaped are entered into the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth. Ye have lived in pleasure on the earth, and been wanton. Ye have nourished your hearts, as in the days of slaughter. Ye have condemned and killed the just, and he doeth not resist you.
We believe that by paying dues, these members could have the services of lawyers and sue plantation owners for cotton that had been stolen from them and false numbers that have been placed in the plantation stores' books.
On the night of September 30th, 1919, Union members gathered in Elaine to discuss their legal plan.
This is in Phillips County. It's basically just a crossroads at this time, a road, a few houses, a railroad side, no streetlights. There's also a one-room wooden church, and that's where the Union met. Expecting that they might have trouble, the Union posted a guard of about 6 men. They had shotguns and rifles. The meeting's taking place. While they're having this discussion, a car rolls up the road.
2 white men were in the car.
By one account, one of the white men in the car said, "You all get away from there." And shortly thereafter, a shot was fired.
Though it remains unclear who fired first, a barrage of gunfire broke out. One of the white men was killed almost instantly. The rumor of a black uprising spread in a matter of hours. The idea of a sharecropper rebellion conveniently played into the hands of landowners who did not want their sharecropping practices scrutinized. They did all they could, as quickly as they could, to sound alarms that black farmers were out for white blood.
The story gets magnified that the town is under attack, that blacks are killing people in the streets, and that there is a revolution afoot.
Sure.
Amos chapter 1 verse 11. Thus saith the Lord Yahweh, for 3 transgressions of Edom, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof. Because he did pursue his brother with the sword, 1, and did cast off all pity, 2, and his anger did tear perpetually, 3, and kept his wrath forever, 4. But I will send a fire upon Teman, which shall devour the palaces of Basra.
Robbers quickly formed self-defense groups, expecting repercussions over the death of a white man. But they could not have predicted just how severe the response would be. The following morning, under the watchful eye of Sheriff Frank Kitchens and his deputies, posses of white men were sent to find, detain, and kill the offenders.
When you have an out-of-control mob just being told there's a Negro insurrection going on, that mob's being very indiscriminate in its violence. You see houses being attacked, black-owned homes being ransacked.
The black school was burnt, notable families were killed.
Black women and children have to go literally hide out in the woods because many of these people are indiscriminately shooting at African American women and their children.
Black veterans and other African Americans took up arms in self-defense.
This no doubt just feeds into the mob fervor. The fact that, oh, they're daring to shoot back at us. This must really be an insurrection.
One historian has identified more than 20 different killing sites where African Americans were being killed.
There are stories that mob members were taking souvenirs, such as ears or fingers from the bodies of fallen African Americans.
Zechariah chapter 1, verse 15. And I am very sore displeased with the heathen that are at ease. For I was but a little displeased, and they helped forward the affliction.
One of the leading black families of the county, they weren't even in the town. They had just received a brother back from the French front. They are pulled from a train, put in the back of a car, and they are stabbed, shot, and their mutilated bodies are left on the side of the road.
Within 2 days, 500 U.S. troops were sent to quell the supposed black uprising.
They don't find any blacks killing or shooting down the streets. In fact, Colonel Jenks reports that the city is filled with hundreds and hundreds of white men with guns. Many of the individuals who were hiding in the thickets were former soldiers who had just gotten back from the war. And when they see the army troops come, they rush out, believing that the army troops are there to assist them. The army believes that these people are rushing toward them to attack, and they're cut down by machine gun fire.
Obadiah chapter 1 in verse 10. It reads, For the violence against thy brother Jacob, shame shall cover thee, and thou shalt be cut off forever. In the day that thou stoodest on the other side, in the day that the strangers carried away captive his forces, and foreigners entered into his gates, and cast lots upon Jerusalem, even thou was as one of them. But thou shouldest not have looked on the day of thy brother, in the day that he became a stranger, talking to Edom. Neither shouldest thou have rejoiced over the children of Judah in the day of their destruction. Neither shouldest thou have spoken proudly in the day of distress. Thou shouldest not have entered into the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Yea, thou shouldest not have looked on their affliction in the day of their calamity, nor have laid hands on their substance in the day of their calamity. Neither shouldest thou have stood in the crossway to cut off those of his that did escape. Neither shouldest thou have delivered up those of his that did remain in the day of distress. For the day of the Lord Yahweh is near upon all the heathen. As thou hast done, it shall be done unto thee. Thy reward shall return upon thy own head. For as ye have drunk upon my holy mountain, so shall all the heathen drink continually. Yea, they shall drink and they shall swallow down, and they shall be as though they have not been. But upon Mount Zion shall be deliverance, and there shall be holiness, and the house of Jacob shall possess their possessions. And the house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau for stubble. And they shall kindle in them and devour them, and there shall not be any remaining of the house of Esau, for the Lord Yahweh, Bahashim Habashah, have spoken it.
Though the exact number will never be known, a recent estimate suggests 237 black men, women, and children were killed. There was an immediate demand for justice, but not for the black lives lost. 5 white men were also killed in the fighting. Hundreds of African Americans were rounded up and put in jail, and when the jail was full, they detained the rest in a schoolhouse.
While they are detained, there is torture going on.
The goal? To elicit false confessions of a black uprising.
They whipped the men, whipped them for long periods of time. They stuffed formaldehyde up their noses, and they stripped them naked and shocked them with electrical charges. They did this until they confessed to the conspiracy.
Robert Hill escaped.
Isaiah 42:22. But this is a people robbed and spoiled. They are all of them snared in holes, and they are hid in prison houses. They are for a prey, and none delivereth, for a spoil, and none saith restore.
To Kansas, but his peers back in Arkansas were not as lucky. 122 indictments were issued, and trials quickly started.
The men were brought into the court in chains. They weren't allowed to consult with their defense attorney. The defense attorney rarely interjected, and then the all-white juries started delivering guilty verdicts. In one case, the guilty verdicts came back in 2 minutes.
It's also important to point out that there were mobs of people outside who were demanding black blood. Governor Bruff maintained that at some point these people would be killed, but they would have to have been killed justly.
The governor lived up to his word, when among the 87 black citizens charged with crimes, 12 were sentenced to death by electric chair. Despite the system being blatantly rigged against them, the convicted men had one unlikely beacon of hope: the American justice system. The trials of the Elaine 12 had been highly publicized. The NAACP took notice and stepped in with legal help for the 12. For 4 years, the team faced a series of legal setbacks and advances, until in 1923, the case made its way to the Supreme Court in what is now known as Moore versus Dempsey. There, the defense argued that the original trials had been mob-dominated, and the black prisoners had been denied their constitutional rights. In a landmark decision, the court agreed.
The good that comes out of this is that the NAACP sees for the first time that it can win in the Supreme Court, that things don't always fall along the color lines.
The 12, subjected to torture, injustice, and litigation travesty, were at long last exonerated and released in January 1925. They might have escaped with their lives, but there was nothing that could reverse the pain and devastation felt by the black community in Phillips County, and no way to unsee the ungodly truth that American men, alongside the American government, were complicit in a massacre of American citizens on American soil.
Everything is the will of the Heavenly Father Yahweh. Now this is a video. It's titled How the U.S. Stole Thousands of Native American Children. Lord's willingness be edifying.
I was adopted by a white missionary couple.
I was adopted.
Immediately placed for adoption.
I was in foster care with one family for 18 years. They were white.
My parents loved us, and I understand that, but at the same time,
they took the idea that they were saving
us from ourselves.
Being saved, and I should be grateful for the life that I've been given, because any child on the reservation would give anything to live as I was living.
They took us away from our mom. They came marching right in and literally took us and thousands of other children from their home.
It's a way to eradicate us, and to go to a nation's children is one of the sure ways to do that.
This is Exodus 21 and 16. It reads, And he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. St. John chapter 10 and verse 10. The thief cometh not but for to steal and to kill and to destroy.
The U.S. has a long and brutal legacy of attempting to eradicate Native Americans. For centuries, they colonized Native American lands and murdered their populations.
This is for educational purposes only. This is for educational purposes only.
They forced them west and pushed them into small, confined patches of land. But Native Americans resisted. A Board of Indian Commissioners report said, instead of dying out under the light and contact of civilization, the Indian population is steadily increasing.
Psalms 55 and 20. He hath put forth his hand against such as be at peace with him, which the conquistadors and Spaniards did when they came over here to the Native American Indians. He hath put forth his hand against such as be at peace with him. He hath broken his covenant. The words of his mouth were smoother than butter, but war was in his heart. His words were softer than oil, yet were they drawing swords.
And that was an obstacle to total American expansion. So the U.S. found a new solution to absorb and assimilate them. It all started with an experiment and a man named Richard Henry Pratt.
He had in his charge some prisoners of war, and he taught these men how to speak English, how to read and write, and how to do labor. He dressed them in military uniforms and basically ran an assimilation experiment.
Now, as the scriptures I read, Isaiah 26 and 10, let favor be showed to the wicked, yet will he not learn righteousness. Now, show you how beautiful Yahweh is. These devils do everything on the left-hand side, which we know. Now, Hebrew Israelites, we write from right to left. The wicked write from left to the right. Show you how the Lord have everything. Everything is spiritual with Yahweh Bashim Yahushua, man. These devils got us writing from left to right. But us, Hebrew Israelites, you so-called Negro, Latino, Native Americans, West Indian Haitians, we write from right to left. Everything is spiritual, man.
And then he took his results to the federal government and said they're capable of being civilized. So he was able to get this project funded.
In 1879, the government funded Pratt's project, the first ever off-reservation boarding school for Native American children. His motto was to kill the Indian and save the man. What started there at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School was nothing short of genocide disguised as American education. Children were forcibly taken from reservations and placed into the school, hundreds, even thousands of miles away from their families. They were stripped of their traditional clothing, their hair was cut short. They were given new names and forbidden from speaking their native languages.
See? This is Psalms 83 and verse 3. It reads, They have taken crafty counsel against thy people and consulted against thy hidden ones. They have said, Come and let us cut them off. They have said, Come and let us cut them off from being a nation, that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance.
to take our children and to indoctrinate them into Western society, to take away their identity as indigenous peoples, their tribal identity. I think it's one of the most effective and insidious ways that the US did do harm to indigenous peoples here, because it targeted our children, our most vulnerable. And they tried to make us ashamed for being Indian, and they tried to make us something other than Indian.
There are also accounts of mental, physical, and sexual abuse, of forced manual labor, neglect, starvation, and death.
Micah chapter 2 and verse 2. And they covet fields and take them by violence, and houses and take them away. So they oppress a man and his house, even a man and his heritage. This is what they do, man.
My great-grandfather went to Carlisle, and nobody in my family ever talked about it. So if you Google Indian boarding schools, the majority of the pictures that you will see will be actually from Carlisle. Colonel Pratt created propaganda. He hired a photographer to create those before and after photos to show that his experiment was working. So it was, intentional propaganda.
And it worked. The Carlisle model of education swept the country and led to the creation of over 350 boarding schools to assimilate Native American children.
On the one hand, we have the Navajo as we find him in the desert. Few of these boys and girls have ever seen a white man. Yet, through the agencies of the government, they are being rapidly brought from their state of comparative savagery and barbarism to one of civilization.
See? Calling them savages. Habakkuk 2 and 5. Yea, also because he transgressed by wine, his philosophies, his policies, his legislation, his democracies, his philosophies, his draconian law, his way of life. He is a proud man, neither keepeth at home, who enlargeth his desire is hell, and is death, and is as death, and cannot be satisfied, but gather unto him all nations, and heapeth unto him all people. Who is the main two people? Those two nations, those two countries in Ezekiel 35, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom.
In 1900, there were about 20,000 Native American children in these schools. By 1925, that number more than tripled. Families that refused to send their kids to these schools faced consequences like incarceration at Alcatraz or the withholding of food rations. Some parents who did lose their children to these schools even camped outside to be close to them. Many students...
Habakkuk 2 and 8. Because thou hast spoiled many nations, all the remnant of the people shall spoil thee, because of men's blood, and for the violence of the land, and of the cities, and of all that dwell therein. Woe unto him that coveteth an evil covetousness to his house, that he may set his nest on high, that he may be delivered from power of evil.
Students ran away. Some found ways to hold on to their languages and cultures. Others, though, could no longer communicate with family members.
See? He oppressed a man in his house, man. Even the man in his heritage.
By stripping the children of their Native American identities,
See?
the U.S. government had found a way to disconnect them from their lands. And that was part of the U.S. strategy. During the same era in which thousands of children were sent away to boarding schools, a number of U.S. policies infringed on their tribal lands back home.
Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. Be not deceived. Yahweh, Bahashim Yahweh Shai is not marked. For whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap. For he that soweth to the flesh, shall of the flesh reap corruption. But he that soweth to the Spirit, shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. This is Colossians chapter 3 and verse 25. It reads, But he that doeth wrong shall receive for the wrong which he have done, and there is no respect of persons. This is James chapter 2 and verse 13. It reads, For he shall have judgment without mercy that have showed no mercy, and mercy rejoiceth against judgment. 2 Thessalonians chapter 1 and verse 6 reads, Seeing it is a righteous thing with Yahweh, Bahashim Yahweh Shai, to recompense tribulation to them that trouble you, and to you who are troubled, rest with us, which is the Hebrew Israelites, you so-called Negro, Latino, Native Americans, West Indian Haitians. When the Lord Yahweh Shai shall be revealed from heaven with his mighty angels, which will tell you that in Psalms 68 and 17, in the flaming fire, taking vengeance on them that know not power, and that obey not the gospel of our Lord Yahweh Shai HaMashiach, who shall be punished with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord Yahweh, which I read in Obadiah 1 and 18, and from the glory of his power. You gotta pay. Your judgment is due.
In less than 5 decades, 2/3 of Native American lands had been taken away.
The whole thing was purposeful. And the fact that it has been buried in the history books and not acknowledged is also intentional. And in fact, the same tactics were used in New Zealand, Australia, Canada. All of these countries have acknowledged, apologized, or reconciled in some way, except for the United States.
Over time, the brutality of boarding schools started to surface. And after a 1928 report detailed the horrific conditions at some schools, many began to close. In the 1960s, indigenous activism rose alongside the civil rights movement. And by the 1970s, that activism forced more schools to shut down. The government handed over control of the remaining boarding schools to tribes to be run in partnership with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But
Psalms 75 and 8. For in the hand of the Lord Yahweh there is a cup, and the wine is red, it is full of mixture, and he poureth out of the same. But the dregs thereof, all the wicked of the earth, shall wring them out and drink them. Isaiah 51 and 22 reads, Thus saith thy Lord, the Lord Yahweh, and thy power, that pleadeth the cause of his people. Behold, I have taken out of thy hand the cup of trembling, even the dregs of the cup of my fury. Thou shalt no more drink it again. He's talking to you so-called Negro, Latino, Native Americans, West Indian, and Haitians. But I will put it into the hand of them that afflict thee. Who afflicted you? All 17 nations that are upon the face of the earth. The Lord created 18 nations on the earth. You 12 tribes of Israel is one nation. The other 17 nations are your enemies. They hate you. But I will put it into the hand of all them that afflict thee. Jeremiah 30 and 16. Which have said to thy soul, bow down, that we may go over. That's at Zechariah 11 and 5. And thou hast laid thy body as the ground, and as the streets to them that went over.
just as the boarding school era started fading, another assimilation project took shape: adoption. The main goal of this pilot project was to stimulate the adoption of American Indian children to primarily non-Indian adoptive homes. They claimed it was to promote the adoption of the forgotten child, but it was essentially a continuation of the boarding school assimilation tactics. And the strategy came with a financial advantage for the government too. Adoption was cheaper than running boarding schools. But first, adoption officials had to sell white America on the idea of adopting Native American children. Feature stories like this one in Good Housekeeping marketed them to white families. They were described as unwanted, and adoption gave them a chance at new lives.
Wow.
In the end, their media campaign worked. White families wanted Indian adoption. But the problem was, many of these children were not orphans that nobody wanted. They were kids often ripped apart from families that wanted to keep them.
You still will hear stories today of people, my age, older, saying, I remember as a child, the social worker was coming and people would hide their children.
On reservations, social workers used catch-all phrases like child neglect or unfit parenting as evidence for removal. But their criteria was often questionable. Some accounts describe children being taken away for living with too many family members in the same household.
An extended family is a big thing for Native people, and that means being judged for being in a house that's overcrowded. So it's always whiteness is the standard for success. And everything else is judged by that standard.
Wow.
By the 1960s, about 1 in 4 Native children were living apart from their families. The official Indian Adoption Project placed 395 Native American children into mostly white homes, but it was just one of many in an era of Native American adoptions. Other state agencies and private religious organizations began increasingly making placements for Native American children too.
My mother giving me up was a white person telling her if she didn't, she would never see her other kids again.
In one of the documents I have, it's addressed to my biological father, Victor Fox, that he was trying to look us up to get a hold of us. But Hennepin County wrote, Daniel and Douglas are adapting very well in their new family. Just was totally, it was a false statement.
When you're adopted, you know you're missing something. I think I've likened it to having when someone has a 500-piece puzzle and they have all the pieces to make this pretty picture except one.
My adopted mother was not well, verbally, physically, and sexually, and spiritually abusive. So by the time I was 14, I started drinking. 15, drugs were added, and I became an addict to numb. I didn't realize I was numbing pain.
I tried suicide, tried slicing my wrist one time.
Children were taken and believed like I believed for a long time that there was something wrong with me versus something wrong with the system.
The Indian Adoption Project was considered a success by the people who set it in motion. Officials claimed, generally speaking, we believe the Indian people have accepted the adoption of their children by Caucasian families and have been pleased to learn the protection afforded these children. But the truth was unsettling.
These hearings on Indian children's welfare is now in session.
Well, I was pregnant with Bobby, and the welfare kept coming over there and asking me if I'd give him up for adoption.
Before he was even born?
Yeah. They picked up my children and placed them in a foster home. And I think that they were abused in a foster home.
4 years after Native people organized in this Senate hearing, Congress passed the Indian Child Welfare Act, known as ICWA.
It gives tribes a place at the table in court.
States would be required to provide services to families to prevent removal of an Indian child. And in case removal was necessary, they would have to try to keep the child with extended family or another Native American family.
Without our relatives, we cease to exist. So with Native people, part of our wealth is in our family. It's in who we're connected to.
But the legacy of family separation in Native communities has been difficult to fully undo. Today, Native American children are 4 times more likely to be placed in foster care than white children, even when their families have similar presenting problems. In these cases, ICWA is often the best legal protection they have, and it's been under attack repeatedly.
A young girl ripped from her foster family because of the Indian Children Welfare Act.
White adoptive families intent on keeping Native American children have tried to do away with the act, and they're often backed by conservative organizations.
The Indian Child Welfare Act was dealt a blow earlier this month.
The subject of a lawsuit issued on Tuesday by the Goldwater Institute, arguing that preferences given to American Indian families to adopt Indian children is unconstitutional and discriminates based on race.
It's a way for these industries, these very powerful industries, to try to attack what Indian identity is.
Wanting to overturn ICWA is connected to everything about who we are as a nation. So if we don't have any protections for our families, and if we don't have protections for our treaties, then we have no more Indians.
We've been under attack. We're going to continue to be under attack, and we have to keep fighting.
It's in our DNA to survive.
We are nations that pre-exist European contact, and we are still here.
This is Genesis chapter 49 and verse 18. It reads, Gad, a troop shall overcome him, but he shall overcome at the last. At the last. When the Heavenly Father Yahweh sent his son Yahweh back, we all, as a nation, the hopeful elect on this side, the elect, the predestined, will overcome in the last. This is Jeremiah 49 and verse 12. And it reads, For thus saith the Lord Yahweh, Behold, they whose judgment was not to drink of the cup have surely drunken. And art thou he that shall altogether go unpunished? Thou shalt not go unpunished, but thou shalt surely drink of it. Proverbs 16 and 4 reads, The Lord hath made all things for himself, yea, even the wicked for the day of evil. This is Joel chapter 3 and verse 19. It reads, Egypt shall be a desolation, and Edom shall be a desolate wilderness, for the violence against the children of Judah, because thou hast shed innocent blood in their land. But Judah shall dwell forever, and Jerusalem from generation to generation. Lamentation chapter 4 and verse 21. Rejoice and be glad, O daughter of Edom, that dwellest in the land of Uz. The cup also shall pass through unto thee, thou shalt be drunken, and shalt make thyself naked. The punishment of thy iniquity is accomplished, O daughter of Zion. He will no more carry thee away into captivity. He will visit thy iniquity, O daughter of Edom. Yahweh, Bahashim Yahweh will visit you soon hereafter. He will discover thy sins. Isaiah 14 and 21 reads, Prepare slaughter for his children, for the iniquity of their fathers, that they do not rise, nor possess the land, nor fear the face of the world with cities. For I will rise up against them, saith the Lord Yahweh of hosts, and cut off from Babylon the name and remnant and son and nephew, saith the Lord. This is Zechariah chapter 9 and verse 12. It reads, Turn ye to the stronghold, ye prisoners of hope. Talking to you Negro, Latino, and Native Americans. Even to the day do I declare that I will render double unto thee. When I have bent Judah for me, filled the bow with Ephraim, and raised up thy sons O Zion, against thy sons, O Greece, and made thee as the sword of a mighty man. And the Lord Yahweh shall be seen over them, to my the elect, and his arrow shall go forth as the lightning, to my those missiles, those that concentrated heat come from the chariots. And the Lord Yahweh power shall blow the trumpet, and shall go with whirlwind of the south. The Lord Yahweh of hosts shall defend them. Take it in Isaiah 31. And they shall devour and subdue with sling stones, and they shall drink and make a noise as through wine, and they shall be filled like bowls, and as the corners of the altar, and as the corners of the altar. And the Lord Yahweh, Bahashim Yahweh shall their power, shall save them in that day as the flock of his people, for they shall be as the stones of a crown lifted up as an ensign upon the land. This is Sirach, Ecclesiasticus 33 and verse 10. It reads, And all men are from the ground, and Adam was created of earth. In much knowledge the Lord Yahweh, Bahashim Yahushua, have divided them and made their ways diverse. Some of them have he blessed and exalted, and some of them have he sanctified and set near himself. But some of them have he cursed and brought low. This is talking about you, Job 9:24. You Idumeans, and turned out of their places. As the clay is in the potter's hand to fashion it at his pleasure, so man is in the hand of him that made him to render to them as liking him best. And why would you trust the enemy when the Lord made them to be the wicked? The Lord made them to be your whooping stick. It say, as the clay is in the potter's hand to fashion it at his pleasure, so man is in the hand of him that made him to render to them as liking him best. Two precepts to link with that. Isaiah 29:16 reads, Surely your turning of things upside down shall be esteemed as the potter's clay. For shall the work say of him that made it, he made me not? Or shall the thing framed say unto him that framed it, he have none understanding? So he made you to be the vessels of wrath, what? Fitted for destruction. Romans 9:22. What if power willing to show his wrath and to make his power known, enduring with much long suffering the vessels of wrath fitted to destruction? You was made to be the wicked of the earth. Back in Ecclesiasticus 33 and verse 14. Good is set against evil, and life against death. So is the godly against the sinner, and the sinner against the godly. So look upon all the works of the Most High, and there are 2 and 2, one against another. There are 2 and 2, one against another. This is Genesis 25 and 21. And Isaac entreated the Lord Yahweh for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord Yahweh was entreated of him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. And the children struggled together within her. And she said, If it be so, why am I thus? And she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord Yahweh said unto her, 2 nations are in thy womb, one against another. And 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. And the one people shall be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger. Again, Ecclesiastes 33 and 15 reads, So look upon all the works of the Most High, and there are 2 and 2, one against another. You see, the Lord made them to be separate from you. They are the wicked of the earth. They are the vessels of wrath fitted for destruction. Lord's witness edifying. Gotta give all praise, honor, and glory to Yahweh, Bahashem, Yahweh Shah,
Program is brought to you by Emory University.
Bahashem, Rikah, Quadash. Double honors to the apostles and elders of Great Millstone who rule well, who teach well, and a sincere salutation to all the doctrine, pushing the truth and believing the truth throughout the 4 ends of the earth, the entire world, waking up the hopeful elect. And shalom to the Agua for what listening and learning.
Tulsa, the African American community in Tulsa was relatively prosperous, well educated. I mean, they had done everything that they were supposed to do in terms of the American dream. You work hard, you save your money, you go to school, you buy property. I mean, this is what they had done under horrific conditions. I mean, when you look at the context of what Black America looked like at the time, the fact that they were able to do this is one of the things that we herald in terms of when we talk about the immigrant story, right? But instead, this created such seething resentment in Tulsa that you had Black doctors, Black attorneys, Black businessmen. I mean, in fact, this area of Tulsa was known as Black Wall Street, to give you some sense of how much it held in terms of value, in terms of esteem, in terms of worth. But that resentment in Tulsa was so intense that it was just waiting for a spark to just ignite it. That spark was a Black messenger was delivering a message. You know, they had messengers back in the day, was delivering a message downtown. And he gets in the elevator, and there's a white woman in the elevator. I believe she was the elevator operator. And from the first floor through the third floor, I mean, the elevator may have bumped or something, and he hit her a little bit, but he didn't hit her, he just got a brush against her. She yelled, rape. Now, to understand what the charge of rape means when a white woman yells rape against a Black man in this period, because part of understanding the violence that African Americans faced was to deal with the issue of what was called the sanctity of white womanhood. And that sanctity of white womanhood said that all white women had to be protected from Black beast, so-called Black beast. And when she yelled rape, now the charge was absolutely improbable from the first floor through to the third floor. Improbable. But it was the spark. They couldn't wait because he was the son of a prominent Black businessman. So they hauled him, the police hauled him down to the station. Well, the Black elite came down to the station going, you know, this is my son, this is my boy. My son wouldn't do this. What's his bail? You know, and I'm like, oh, uppity. How dare you come down here? How dare you? And because the African American community sensed that the sense of anger and violence was rising, it wasn't one or two that came down. There were several of them that came down. They're like, oh, so what, are you going to storm the jail? They said, no, but we're here for justice. We're here for justice. And then the lynch mob began to form in Tulsa. It was like, oh, these are some uppity Negroes.
As for us, Lamentation 4:17. As for us, our eyes is yet failed for our vain help. In our watching, we have watched for a nation that could not save us.
Who need to be put back in their place. And the violence began. Black Tulsa was, the lynch mob rode in, but they also came in airplanes, dropping bombs on Tulsa. Black Tulsa. There are descriptions and depictions of African Americans being decapitated, being forced to kneel down and just having their heads severed. There are the pictures of the strafings, of the bombings, of the shootings. Nobody's quite sure what the death toll is. But when you look at the pictures, what you see is an area that had once been thriving. What we say is the American dream, absolutely leveled by the violence, by the lynch mobs, by the airplanes, by the bombs, leveled. Black Tulsa has never recovered. As the bombings are happening, as the violence is happening, as Tulsa is on fire, the governor of Oklahoma is like, whoa, maybe, we should. The feds are looking up going, this is not our issue. Wow. Nothing we can do here.
You see? Lord willing is edifying. Until next time, I say Shalom, Wa Abad Babal. Ye are hated because you are the salt of the earth. Shalom.